Christianity has been, at least in the past, the dominant religious tradition of our country and, in fact, of all of Western culture. So at this time of cultural reassessment regarding racial difference, regarding multiculturalism, regarding globalization, regarding law and order and social and economic justice, regarding how we interact with those with whom we disagree, regarding leadership and individuality and community. It's all up in the air. It's all being reassessed. So the church as a whole, at this moment, and each congregation and each individual Christian needs to atone for and provide remedies for the part that we have played in creating and supporting views that have only made the problems worse. And without such self-reflection, without such self-examination, without a truly converting, deep transformation, our claim to bring the love and compassion, healing and hope of Jesus to the current situation rings very hollow, seems very naive, if not hypocritical. Racism is a social construct. Race itself is a social construct. There's no scientific justification for the simplistic categories that we use to classify groups based on some arbitrary physical characteristic. Genetics is way more complicated than that. But race has become an excuse, an explanation for, a justification of the process of othering, of identifying some people as like me and other people as not like me. Seeing some group of people as family, others as allies, others as strangers, others as enemies. And that's something that's been going on since before we all came out of Africa less than 100,000 years ago. And began our hunting and gathering expansion that has come to cover the earth and diversify the gene pool.
Oh, I got it.
Maybe it was a way of life that worked for a while, maybe for a long while, tens of thousands of years. The wandering groups of 100 or so competing or cooperating usually didn't bump into each other very much. So obviously it worked when you consider the spread and success of our species as a whole. I mean, maybe it's just a byproduct of various strands of DNA competing to reproduce more than their opponents. I don't really know, but tribalism has been around for a long time. And racism is one expression of it. But now, with 7 billion of us, we bump into each other a lot. And the friction has gotten worse. The violence has escalated and gotten out of hand. The othering has created a suicidal cycle of hate that has to stop if we're going to survive in any kind of reasonable way. It has to be transformed, converted somehow. We don't have the time or space for this constant competition. We need to cooperate with each other and with the earth if we're to have any kind of hope. Now, where religion and faith come into this has been in the way that religion, the scriptures, the tradition, the rituals, the institution have been used to justify division, to celebrate othering, have been used to look at the in-group as chosen and the out-group as suspect, if not downright evil. The power of the religious instinct has been harnessed by those in power. And we find that in 2 out of the 3 lessons that we had today. If you weren't able to hear the first lesson, it was about the expulsion of Ishmael from the camp of Abraham at the request of his wife Sarah, because she was jealous of Hagar, Ishmael's mother, after the birth of Isaac, the son of Abraham and Sarah. There's an alternate story in the Quran from a different perspective. But all these stories of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, even Moses, are not only stories about the evolution of the human relationship with God, but they're also stories that are told about the relationships between the 12 tribes of Israel, between the 12 tribes of Israel and their neighbors, their friends and enemies, strangers, allies. Stories of various ancestors of tribes were woven together into a family genealogy. Who was a brother? Who was a half-brother? Who inherited what? And it was all related to later tribal and intertribal relationships. Who was family? Who was a friend? Who was an ally? Who was a stranger? Who was an enemy? These are the same questions that have been asked for 100,000 years. Although here, it's in the context that carries religious significance. Somehow these divisions and alliances and enmities get sanctioned by God, supposedly. The story of the expulsion of Ishmael is a story about the alienation, but some continuing connection between Jews and Arabs. And that's a connection and alienation that is still influencing the history of the world. And then in Matthew, with his depiction of Jesus commenting on the relationship between his followers and the outside world of potential enmity between family members, rejection, communal persecution. This is a reflection of the situation that existed at the time of Matthew, not at the time of Jesus. The time of Jesus, there really wasn't much of an outside world. I suppose there were the Romans, but all the Jews ignored the Romans. And the Romans pretty much ignored the Jews. They certainly didn't care much about yet another Jewish faith healer to talk about the kingdom of God coming. But it was when the persecution started that there began to be a kind of toxic Christian defensiveness, a celebration of martyrdom that created a culture of victimhood in the church. And that victimhood took revenge when it finally came to power under Emperor Constantine. Heretics were banished. Most of their books were burned. Pagans were either baptized, and if they wouldn't be baptized, they were open to be killed. The sword that Peter had put back in his sheath in the garden came out in the Crusades against the descendants of Ishmael. But I suppose to stay fair, the Christians went after Isaac as well, because it was out of this us versus them stance of empowered Christian victimhood that an anti-Semitism arose that would be as virulent and destructive as any racism based on color, right up through the 20th century. And of course, incorporation of racism and the support of the institution of slavery were central to much American evangelical teaching down through that same 20th century. John Dodson has done some extensive study and work on this very sad component of our Christian tradition, but it's one that's undeniable. This tribalism, this triumphalism, this Jewish or Christian nationalism that turns faith into some kind of battle flag has nothing to do with the truth of sacrificial love that was taught and lived by Jesus. No matter how many proof texts you can find in the Bible that may say otherwise. If that's indeed what the apostles thought, they were misunderstanding it. We are called to serve the world, not to conquer it. The Christian church is not just some other tribal group competing with other groups around it. Our religion, our faith are not some part of our lives. They are a guidance, a way, an insight into the whole of our lives. It's the foundation of our lives. It's what's really happening in our lives, the meaning of our lives. Where we find harmony, not hatred. Relationship, not rivalry. And unity, not division. We celebrate diversity. We don't fear it. It's a creation of God. The central theme of the life of Jesus was that in the midst of all the chaos the world can bring up, he knew that he was living in the kingdom of God. Love connected everything. Families, allies, strangers, and even enemies. All we are called to do is walk in that same way. Not to argue about our faith, not to try to defend our faith or proselytize someone into joining our faith, but just to live our faith and be Christ for the world. to really walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself for us, an offering and sacrifice to God in any situation or relationship that may arise in front of us. Living in the kingdom, in the context of eternity, transcending even death, doesn't put us on the winning side or the side of the angels. Doesn't mean we're right instead of wrong, good instead of bad. It's just that we have discovered how to live in reality, seeing life the way it really is, all connected and created by God and blown through by the Spirit. All in God, all in love. If we can face and reject our blinded past, when we use the status of our faith to affirm our own power and privilege, if we can begin to show justice, love mercy, walk humbly in the way that Jesus taught us, we will find ourselves standing before a very merciful God, given all the mess we've created. A God who will be eager to forgive and will then put us to work at this time and place of darkness, where I think we're beginning to see the light. Thanks be to God.